In the era of the Malacca Sultanate, there was a village at the foot of Mount Ledang, where a clear river flowed. One day, Sultan Mahmud went hunting in that area. After some time, he left his companions and wandered alone, enjoying the beauty of nature around him. Suddenly, he spotted a beautiful woman by the riverbank, picking flowers. She looked up and smiled sweetly at the Sultan. Captivated by her smile, he hurried towards her, but before he could reach her, she vanished. The Sultan searched everywhere but could not find her. He returned to the palace feeling disappointed. That night, he couldn't sleep, constantly thinking about the mysterious woman. The next day, he summoned his ministers for an audience. They gathered, and the Sultan shared his experience and what he had seen by the river the previous night. The Bendahara informed him that he had encountered the Princess of Mount Ledang, who resided at the summit of the mountain. The Bendahara described the princess's beauty to the Sultan, and intrigued by the story, the Sultan ordered the Bendahara to arrange a wedding party to propose to the princess. The gifts for the Princess of Mount Ledang had to be extraordinary, including gold-threaded songket fabric and exquisite jewelry adorned with precious gems. As the Bendahara busied himself with the preparations, he had a strange dream in which the Sultan's son was covered in blood. The Bendahara shared this dream with the other ministers. Days later, after all preparations were made, the wedding party set off for Mount Ledang. The journey up the mountain was arduous, and they occasionally faced attacks from wild beasts like tigers and lions. Nevertheless, they pressed on despite not seeing the princess or her palace. A few hours later, they encountered a hunchbacked old woman who advised them to return to the palace and abandon their intention to seek the princess. However, the ministers were determined to face any danger to fulfill the Sultan's command. The old woman invited them to her hut. After walking for several hours, they arrived at her dilapidated cottage, where they were served food while listening to her stories. As they listened, they grew drowsy and eventually fell asleep. When they awoke, they were shocked to find that the hut and food had vanished, leaving only a tree behind. Night had fallen. In truth, the old woman was not an ordinary hag but the Princess of Mount Ledang, who had disguised herself to deter the wedding party. That night, they couldn't sleep peacefully, disturbed by shadows and terrifying sounds. The next day, they were all exhausted and frightened. Tun Mamat volunteered to go alone. Days later, Tun Mamat arrived at a fragrant flower garden. After passing through it, he came upon a magnificent palace surrounded by floating clouds. Several beautiful maidens greeted him at the entrance. Before Tun Mamat could enter, he heard the sounds of drums and flutes. The maidens began to sing and dance. Afterward, he was served delicious food. Once he finished eating, the drums and flutes resumed, and everyone stood up immediately. The Princess of Mount Ledang appeared, and Tun Mamat was mesmerized by her stunning beauty, her face radiant like a blooming rose. Tun Mamat conveyed the Malacca Sultan's proposal to the princess, who nodded in response. The bearer of gifts opened chests to reveal the offerings inside. The princess smiled softly but seemed unimpressed by the extravagant gifts. She agreed to accept the Sultan's proposal only if he could fulfill several conditions. After hearing the conditions laid out by the princess, the wedding party quickly returned to the palace. Upon their return, they relayed the princess's requests to the Sultan. The Sultan did not respond immediately. He retreated to his chamber and re-emerged 2 days later after deep contemplation. It was quite challenging to meet the princess's demands. Although he could build bridges of gold or silver, obtaining a plate of mosquito hearts, a jar of young coconut water, and a bowl of his son's blood proved impossible. The Sultan then vowed never to send another wedding party to Mount Ledang. The ministers welcomed the Sultan's decision with joy, all acknowledging the wisdom of the Princess of Mount Ledang in finding a clever way to reject the Sultan's proposal. One of the lessons from this story is not to have excessively high ambitions that neglect our true responsibilities. Instead, we should be wise in solving problems without hurting others' feelings, much like the saying, pulling hair from flower without breaking it, and without spilling the flour.